I still remember the moment my own son threw my steak onto the grass like I was a stray dog at the edge of his yard. It happened on a warm Sunday afternoon in early June, the kind of day when the air smells like charcoal and fresh-cut grass, and neighbors wander between backyards carrying plates of potato salad and cold drinks. My son Jason had invited everyone for a big barbecue at his place, the same house he moved into about 2 years ago, the one with the wide wooden deck and the tall maple tree casting shade across the yard. I pulled my old pickup truck into the driveway just before 3 in the afternoon, noticing how the street was already lined with shiny cars belonging to Jason's friends and coworkers. There was music playing softly from speakers on the deck, and I could hear laughter drifting over the fence before I even stepped out of the truck. I grabbed the small paper bag from the passenger seat, the one with a 6-pack of root beer and a homemade pie I had baked that morning, and walked slowly toward the gate. When I opened it, the smell of grilled meat and barbecue sauce filled the air, and I saw about 20 people scattered across the yard. Some were standing near the grill talking with Jason, others were sitting at folding tables under bright patio umbrellas. My daughter-in-law Emily was arranging plates on a long table near the house while their 10-year-old son Noah chased a soccer ball across the lawn. For a moment I just stood there watching the scene, thinking how different everything looked compared to the small apartment Jason used to live in when he first got married. This house was something else entirely, 2 stories tall with large windows and a brand new wooden fence around the backyard. I had seen it plenty of times over the past couple of years, but every time I visited I still found myself studying the place the way someone might look at a photograph from another life. Jason noticed me eventually. He turned away from the grill, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked over with a casual smile that never quite reached his eyes. He gave me a quick handshake instead of a hug and said he was glad I could make it. I handed him the bag with the pie and drinks, and he passed it off to Emily without even looking inside. Nobody said anything rude at that moment, nothing you could point to and call disrespect, but something about the way Jason spoke to me felt colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the way his friends looked at me like I was just another neighbor wandering in from the street, or maybe it was the way Jason kept calling the house his place with that proud tone in his voice. I found an empty chair near the edge of the yard and sat down, watching people laugh and talk around the grill while the afternoon sun dipped slowly behind the trees. For a while everything looked normal enough. Plates were filled, drinks were passed around, and the smell of sizzling steak drifted through the yard. But even then, sitting quietly at that table, I had the strange feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change the way everyone in that backyard looked at me before the evening was over. The afternoon sun drifted lower across the backyard while the smell of grilled food grew stronger with every minute that passed, and I sat there quietly watching the way my son moved around the grill like he owned not only the house but the entire neighborhood. Jason had always been confident, even when he was a boy, but lately that confidence carried a sharp edge that had not been there before. His friends stood around him holding cold drinks while he flipped steaks on the grill and talked about work, investments, and the housing market as if he had built everything in his life completely on his own. I could hear bits of the conversation from my chair near the edge of the yard. One man in a blue polo shirt asked Jason how long he had owned the place, and Jason laughed proudly before saying that it had been the best decision he ever made. He spoke about the property value rising and the way the neighborhood had become one of the most desirable areas in the county. A few of the guests nodded with admiration while another neighbor joked that Jason must be doing something right to afford a place like this before turning 40. Jason smiled at that comment and raised his drink slightly like a quiet toast to his own success. I noticed that none of them asked me anything. They did not ask where I lived or how I knew Jason. Some of them probably assumed I was just another older neighbor wandering through the gate for free food and conversation. Emily walked past the table carrying a tray of hamburger buns and gave me a polite smile that felt more like a habit than real warmth. She had always been friendly enough, but there was a careful distance in the way she spoke to me these days, as if she was never quite sure where I belonged in their new life. My grandson Noah ran past me again chasing his soccer ball and stopped long enough to say hello before sprinting back toward the lawn where a few other kids had started a small game. At least he still greeted me the same way he always had, without hesitation or awkwardness. After a while, Jason called everyone closer to the grill because the food was finally ready. People lined up with paper plates while he placed thick steaks and grilled chicken onto the serving tray. The heat from the grill rose into the air while the sound of sizzling meat mixed with music drifting from the speakers on the deck. I waited patiently near the end of the line, listening to the conversations around me. Two of Jason's coworkers were talking about how lucky he was to have bought this house when he did. One of them said that homes in this neighborhood were already selling for almost $100,000 more than they had just a few years ago. Jason responded with a confident laugh and said that timing and smart decisions made all the difference. When my turn finally came, I stepped forward and picked up a plate. Jason looked at me for a second with a strange expression that I could not quite read. Then he placed a large steak on my plate without saying anything. I thanked him and moved toward the table where the condiments and side dishes were arranged. The yard was full of conversation and laughter again as everyone began eating. For a few minutes it almost felt like a normal family gathering. I sat down at the same chair near the edge of the yard and picked up my fork, but before I could take the first bite I heard Jason's voice again from behind me, louder this time, carrying across the yard in a way that made several people turn their heads. There was something in his tone that made the air around the table suddenly feel heavier, as if the easy rhythm of the afternoon had quietly come to an end and something else was about to begin. I turned slowly in my chair when I heard Jason's voice calling out behind me, and the tone was different from the casual conversations that had filled the yard all afternoon. It carried across the grass in a sharp way that made several guests pause in the middle of their meals. Jason walked toward the table where I was sitting, still holding the grilling tongs in one hand as if he had stepped away from the grill just to say something important. A few of his friends followed him with curious expressions, drinks in their hands, while others looked over from the deck. Emily stood near the cooler watching quietly, her smile fading slightly as she sensed the tension building. I kept my fork resting on the edge of my plate and waited for Jason to speak, hoping perhaps he only wanted to make a joke or say something harmless in front of his guests. Jason looked down at the plate in front of me where the steak was still sitting untouched. Then he laughed softly, the kind of laugh that invites other people to join even if they do not understand the reason yet. One of his coworkers asked what was so funny, and Jason shook his head like he was about to share a story everyone would enjoy. He pointed the metal tongs toward my plate and said loudly enough for half the yard to hear that some people never learn when they are overstaying their welcome. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, unsure whether the comment was meant to be playful or serious. I stayed quiet, watching him carefully, because sometimes silence tells you more about a moment than words ever could. Jason stepped closer to the table and tapped the edge of my plate lightly with the tongs. Then he said that he had worked hard to build a life for himself and that not everyone deserved to sit at the same table enjoying it. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge that made the nearby conversations fade into silence. I saw one neighbor glance toward Emily as if waiting for her to interrupt, but she remained still beside the cooler, her hands folded together. Jason leaned forward slightly and picked up the plate in front of me before I could react. For a second the entire backyard seemed to hold its breath. The children stopped chasing the soccer ball across the lawn, and the music from the speakers continued playing softly in the background as if it did not understand the moment unfolding. Jason held the plate in one hand and looked around at his guests with a smirk that suggested he was about to deliver the punchline to a joke. Then, without any hesitation, he tipped the plate forward so the steak slid off and landed on the grass beside the table. A few people gasped quietly while others stared at the ground where the meat rested against the green lawn. Jason lowered the empty plate back onto the table and shrugged his shoulders as though the gesture was nothing more than casual humor. Then he said the words that would stay with me long after the barbecue ended. He told me that if I wanted meat so badly I could go chew it from the ground like a dog in the yard. For a moment nobody spoke. The air felt heavy with disbelief while people glanced from Jason to me, waiting for some kind of reaction. I looked down at the steak lying in the grass and then back at my son's face, realizing that this moment had become something much bigger than a careless joke in front of friends. For a few seconds after Jason's words fell across the yard, nobody moved. The quiet felt heavier than any argument ever could. I looked down at the steak resting in the grass beside the table, the smoke from the grill still drifting through the warm afternoon air, and I could feel dozens of eyes shifting between me and my son. Some of the guests looked uncomfortable, others simply confused, unsure whether they had just witnessed a cruel joke or something far more serious. I slowly placed my fork on the plate in front of me and wiped my hands on the napkin without rushing. Jason was still standing there with the metal tongs hanging loosely from his hand, watching me with the same smirk that had been on his face a moment earlier. A few of his friends gave short nervous laughs that faded quickly when they realized nobody else was laughing. Emily remained near the cooler, her expression tense, as if she wanted to say something but did not know where to begin. My grandson Noah stood near the edge of the lawn holding his soccer ball, staring at the ground where the steak had landed. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. The movement alone seemed to pull the attention of the entire yard toward me. The wooden legs of the chair scraped softly against the patio stones, and even that small sound felt loud in the silence. I bent down carefully and picked up the plate that Jason had set back on the table earlier. For a moment I studied the empty surface of the plate as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Then I placed it neatly back where it had been and looked across the yard at my son. Jason crossed his arms over his chest and waited, clearly expecting anger or shouting. Instead, I simply looked around at the people gathered in the backyard. Some of them avoided my eyes while others watched with quiet curiosity. The music from the speakers continued playing a cheerful country song that now felt strangely out of place in the stillness that had taken over the barbecue. I glanced down once more at the steak in the grass before speaking. My voice sounded calm, even to my own ears. I said that it was an impressive barbecue and that Jason had clearly invited many successful people to enjoy the afternoon with him. I told him the house looked well maintained and that the yard had never looked better. A few guests exchanged puzzled looks because my words did not match the humiliation that had just taken place. Jason let out a short laugh and said that if I was finished with my little speech I could go ahead and pick my dinner up from the lawn like he suggested. His tone was light but carried the same sharp edge as before. I nodded slowly as if I had expected that response. Then I took a step away from the table and looked toward the house itself, the tall windows reflecting the late afternoon sunlight, the fresh paint on the fence, and the wide wooden deck where several guests were still standing. For a brief moment I simply studied the place in silence. Something inside me shifted in that quiet moment, the kind of realization that arrives after patience has finally reached its limit. When I turned back toward Jason, my voice remained steady. I told him there were some things about that house and about this afternoon that he might want to understand before speaking to me that way again. The words were simple, but they carried enough weight to make several guests lean closer to hear what I would say next. I looked at Jason for a moment longer before speaking again, and although my voice stayed calm, there was something in the silence around us that made the entire yard feel as if it had grown smaller. I told him that before he asked me to eat food from the ground, there was a small detail he might want to remember about the house we were standing in. A few guests shifted slightly, sensing that the moment had turned into something different from the casual afternoon barbecue they had expected. Jason rolled his eyes and said that if I was about to start another lecture then I should make it quick because the burgers were getting cold. I nodded once, not offended, not angry, simply patient in the way that comes from many years of learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. I told him that 22 years ago, long before this house had fresh paint and a new deck, it had been a small place with cracked siding and a leaking roof. I said that most of the people standing in the yard probably did not know that because they had only seen the finished version. A man near the grill frowned slightly as if trying to remember whether he had heard this story before. Jason shrugged and said that everyone starts somewhere and that did not change anything about the steak lying in the grass. I agreed with him politely. Everyone does start somewhere. I said that when Jason was 9 years old his mother and I bought this property with money we barely had. The bank loan was small and the interest rate was not friendly, but it was the only way we could give our family a stable place to live. I reminded him that the garage he had turned into a game room used to be my workshop where I spent late nights repairing furniture for extra money. The deck where his friends were standing had once been a stack of weathered boards that I rebuilt piece by piece on weekends. Emily looked from Jason to me with growing confusion as if she had heard parts of the story before but never the full version. I continued speaking in the same steady tone, explaining that over the years the house slowly improved. The roof was replaced after a summer of overtime shifts. The fence was rebuilt during a winter when the heating bill nearly emptied our savings. Every change happened a little at a time. Jason laughed softly and said that was a nice story, but it still did not explain why I was standing there instead of picking up my dinner from the lawn like he suggested. I nodded again and looked around at the guests who were now completely silent. I told him the reason was simple. The house may have been renovated, the yard may have been expanded, and the property may look very different from the way it once did, but one thing had never changed. The name on the original property documents had always belonged to me. The bank loan had always been in my name. The land title had always remained under my signature. For the first time since the afternoon began, Jason stopped smiling. He stared at me as if trying to decide whether I was serious or joking. I gently explained that when he moved back into the house 2 years earlier after his job transfer, I had allowed him to live there because I believed family should help each other. I had never asked for rent. I had never complained about the noise of weekend parties. I had simply trusted that respect would exist between us. The quiet in the yard grew deeper as the meaning of my words slowly settled over everyone standing there. The silence that followed my explanation did not feel angry or explosive. Instead, it felt heavy and thoughtful, like the moment right before a storm decides whether it will arrive or quietly pass by. Jason stood very still near the grill, the metal tongs now hanging motionless at his side, and for the first time that afternoon his confidence seemed to falter. I did not raise my voice or move closer to him. I simply remained where I was beside the patio table, allowing the meaning of my words to settle across the yard. A few guests slowly shifted their weight as if they suddenly felt they had stepped into a private family moment they had not expected to witness. Emily looked at Jason with an expression that mixed confusion and concern, clearly trying to understand why the atmosphere had changed so quickly. Jason let out a short laugh, but this time it sounded forced. He said that if I was trying to make some kind of dramatic speech, then I should remember that everyone there knew the house belonged to him now because he had been living there for 2 years. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without arguing. I explained calmly that living somewhere and owning it are sometimes two very different things. The property records at the county office still carried my name. The yearly property tax statement still arrived in my mailbox every spring. The insurance policy for the house was still under my account. I had never transferred those documents because there had never been a reason to rush such decisions. I looked around the yard again at the deck, the trimmed hedges, and the grill still smoking quietly beside Jason. I said that I had always been proud that my son built a successful career and could host friends for a comfortable Sunday barbecue. Seeing the house full of laughter had once made me feel that the long years of work had been worthwhile. Jason shifted his stance and glanced briefly at Emily before looking back at me. Some of the guests exchanged uneasy glances as the cheerful music from the speakers continued to play in the background. I told Jason that the reason I mentioned the ownership was not to embarrass him in front of his friends. I said it because respect inside a family should never depend on who currently occupies a room or who is holding the grill tongs during a party. Respect should exist because of the years that came before this afternoon. Noah slowly walked closer from the edge of the yard, still holding his soccer ball, watching the conversation with quiet curiosity. I noticed him and softened my tone slightly. I told Jason that I did not come to the barbecue expecting special treatment or applause. I had come because it was Sunday and because family gatherings are meant to bring people together rather than push them apart. Then I glanced once more at the steak still resting in the grass beside the patio. I said gently that food could always be replaced, but words have a way of staying with people long after the grill has cooled down. Jason stared at the ground for a moment before lifting his eyes again, and the confident smile he had worn earlier in the afternoon was completely gone. Around us the guests stood quietly, realizing that the real story unfolding at the barbecue had nothing to do with food at all but with something far more important that had been waiting beneath the surface for a very long time. I could see the shift in Jason's face long before he said anything. The confidence he had worn earlier like a jacket that fit perfectly now looked uncomfortable, as if it no longer belonged to him. Around us the backyard remained quiet except for the low hum of the speakers and the faint crackle of charcoal in the grill. No one rushed to speak. No one laughed anymore. Even the breeze that moved through the tall maple tree at the edge of the yard seemed to slow down, as though the afternoon itself had paused to listen. Jason cleared his throat and tried to recover the casual tone he had earlier, but the effort did not fully succeed. He said that if the paperwork was still in my name then that was just a technical detail, something we could change later. He reminded everyone that he had been the one paying for groceries, maintaining the lawn, and hosting gatherings like this barbecue. I nodded again because he was not wrong about those things. Living somewhere does involve responsibility, and I had never ignored the effort he had put into maintaining the place. I told him that I appreciated the improvements he had made, and I meant it sincerely. The deck looked stronger than it had 10 years earlier. The garden beds Emily had planted along the fence brought color to the yard that had once been plain and dull. None of those efforts were invisible to me. But appreciation and respect are two separate ideas, and only one of them had been missing this afternoon. Jason shifted his weight again, clearly unsure how to respond. Emily slowly stepped closer to him, her arms folded gently across her chest as she watched the conversation unfold. Some of Jason's friends had quietly stepped toward the edge of the patio, pretending to examine their drinks or check their phones, but their attention remained focused on us. I said calmly that when Jason moved back into the house after his job transfer, I had not asked him for rent because I wanted him to have time to rebuild his savings and settle into his new position. I had trusted that he understood the generosity behind that choice. The house was never meant to become a symbol of power or ownership inside the family. It was meant to be a place where the next generation could stand a little taller because the previous one had worked hard to build the foundation. I glanced toward Noah again and saw him standing closer now, his soccer ball resting quietly under one arm. Children notice more than adults often realize, and I knew this moment would stay with him longer than the taste of any barbecue. I told Jason that the reason I had spoken up was not about the steak lying in the grass. Food is temporary. Pride and kindness are not. When a father comes to visit his son, he hopes to be welcomed with the same dignity he once tried to give that child while raising him. The yard remained silent for another long moment. Finally Jason looked down toward the ground where the steak still rested near the edge of the patio. His shoulders lowered slightly, and the tension in his posture began to soften. Without speaking he walked a few steps across the grass, bent down, and picked the steak up carefully by the edge. Then he carried it to the grill and quietly placed it on a clean plate beside the other food. No one applauded or commented. The gesture itself said more than any speech could have. When Jason turned back toward me his voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon. He said that sometimes people forget where things begin, especially when life starts moving quickly. The statement was simple, but it carried the kind of honesty that cannot be forced. And in that quiet moment, standing in the backyard of the house that had watched our family grow for more than 2 decades, it felt like something important had finally begun to change. I watched Jason place the steak carefully on the clean plate beside the grill, and the simple act carried a weight that every person standing in the yard could feel. No one spoke right away. The air still smelled of charcoal and summer heat, but the tension that had filled the backyard only minutes earlier had begun to ease. Jason stood there for a moment looking at the plate as if he were thinking through something he had not considered before. Emily stepped closer to him and placed a gentle hand on his arm, not to interrupt him but to support him. The gesture was quiet and natural, the kind that happens in families when people realize a moment matters more than a casual afternoon conversation. Jason finally turned back toward me and walked slowly across the patio. His friends moved slightly aside to give him space, their earlier amusement completely gone. When he stopped a few feet away from me, his posture had changed. The sharp edge in his voice from earlier had disappeared, replaced by something more thoughtful. He said that sometimes success makes people believe they built everything on their own. When life moves quickly and responsibilities pile up, it becomes easy to forget the people who helped build the road that made that success possible. His words were not dramatic, but they carried honesty, and that honesty seemed to relax the entire yard. I told him that no father expects perfect behavior from his children. Life teaches lessons slowly, and sometimes those lessons arrive during moments we did not plan. What matters is whether we recognize them when they appear. Jason nodded slightly and glanced toward the house behind him. The large windows reflected the late afternoon sunlight, and the freshly painted deck looked warm and welcoming again instead of tense and uncomfortable. He said quietly that when he first moved back into the house 2 years earlier, he had been overwhelmed with his new job and the pressure to prove himself. Hosting gatherings and showing people the house had become a way of convincing himself that he had truly succeeded. Somewhere along the way, he admitted, he stopped thinking about the history behind the place and began treating it like a trophy instead of a home built by family effort. Emily listened carefully and then looked toward me with a gentle expression. She said she had always wondered why I never mentioned the property documents or asked about rent. I explained that family relationships should not feel like business contracts. When a parent helps a child stand up again, the goal is stability, not payment. But generosity only works when it is met with respect. Noah had slowly moved even closer by now, standing just beside the patio table with his soccer ball tucked against his side. He looked from his father to me with the curious seriousness that children have when they sense adults are sharing something important. Jason noticed him and gave a small smile before turning back to me. He said that if Noah remembered anything from the barbecue that day, he hoped it would not be the moment when the steak landed in the grass but the moment when people realized they needed to treat each other better. I told him that lesson would stay longer than any story about food or property. The backyard finally began to breathe again as someone quietly lowered the music and another guest reopened the cooler. Conversations started to return in soft voices around us, and the barbecue that had nearly fallen apart slowly began to feel like a family gathering again. Jason picked up the plate with the steak and brought it back to the table, placing it in front of me with a small nod that said more than a long apology ever could. I looked down at the plate Jason had set in front of me and for a moment I did not touch the steak. The gesture mattered more than the meal itself. Around us the backyard slowly returned to life as quiet conversations began again and the tension that had hung over the barbecue started to fade like smoke drifting into the late afternoon sky. Someone turned the music back up just enough to bring a gentle rhythm into the air, and the soft clinking of bottles and plates reminded everyone that the gathering had originally been meant to celebrate a warm Sunday together. Jason remained standing near the table for a few seconds longer as if he wanted to say more but was still searching for the right words. I could see the same thoughtful expression on his face that he used to have when he was a boy trying to understand a difficult lesson at school. Finally he pulled out the chair beside me and sat down, not as the confident host of the party but as a son who had suddenly remembered something important about where he came from. Emily joined him and offered a quiet smile before passing a bowl of salad across the table to another guest. The normal rhythm of the barbecue returned piece by piece. Laughter started again in small bursts across the yard, and the guests who had been standing awkwardly near the patio began moving back toward the grill and the cooler. Noah approached the table and leaned his soccer ball against the chair before climbing onto the seat beside his father. He looked up at Jason and then at me with a thoughtful curiosity that made both of us smile slightly. Jason reached over and gently ruffled the boy's hair before speaking in a calm voice that carried just far enough for the nearby guests to hear. He said that every house has a story and sometimes the most important part of that story is not the walls or the yard but the people who built it and the lessons they leave behind. Noah nodded slowly even though he probably did not understand every word. Children do not need to understand everything right away for a lesson to stay with them. I finally picked up my fork and cut a small piece of the steak, not because I was hungry but because the moment had returned to something simple and human again. Jason noticed and gave a quiet relieved smile before standing up to check the grill. A few minutes later he returned with a fresh plate of food and placed it beside mine, this time with the easy warmth of a son sharing a meal with his father rather than a host trying to impress his friends. The sun had begun to lower behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the backyard and turning the windows of the house into bright mirrors of evening light. As I looked around at the people talking and laughing again, I realized the barbecue had become something different from what anyone expected when the afternoon began. It was no longer just a gathering of friends around a grill. It had become a reminder that respect inside a family is built the same way a home is built, slowly and carefully, through years of patience, mistakes, forgiveness, and quiet understanding. Jason eventually sat down again across from me and raised his glass slightly in a small gesture of peace. I lifted mine in return, not as a victory and not as a punishment, but simply as a father acknowledging that sometimes the most important lessons arrive in ordinary places like a backyard on a summer Sunday.